once you added your asset library to Blender, it is time to start using it. So how to do that? Well, all we need to do is get our asset browser back here and set it to be our Mossify library, right? And now we can actually drag and drop whatever we want and needs in here, okay? So let's say we're gonna go with the clean forest biome, and the way I set this up is that each biome has 3 subsections. It is the system that scatters the moss, we have the high performance assets, and we have the geometry node assets, right? So almost every single one of our high performance assets is going to have a high detail geometry node setup with it in case you want to customize it or use it for any other goal that you may need. And you can see that each biome has its own geometry nodes, and some of them have even more. For example, the magical biome will have more geometry node systems, and you can use that for anything as well, right? Making mushrooms, customizing it, everything is completely customizable here in the geometry nodes. So let's say we want to drag and drop in our fresh, soft, and green forest biome, right? So I can just drag and drop that onto our Suzanne, and there we go, we have our moss, right? If I go to my rendered view, I have already got my material set up, just a little bark material for fun, and we can see our moss as well. Now by default, we need to crank up our light path a little bit. That is step 1, because we work with textures and alphas, transparency, which means that if we're going to be overlaying our moss planes, right, because we will have a lot at some point, we're going to need a little bit more light paths, right? So I'm going to set the transparent value to 42. That is the number that works everywhere perfectly for me. So that's just something I'm going to set that up, okay? And then what we can do is we can go to the modifier panel, and you can see that we got a lot of customization options here, right? A lot. And the first one that I added is just something performance related, and that is realize instances. Now I don't use this a lot, but sometimes when you have a lot of moss, you have a full scene with multiple biomes, right? For example, in the preview video, I had all 7 biomes in one file and there was a lot of moss going on, then it may get a little bit slow in your viewport, right? Because it's going to be calculating those geometry nodes pretty much all the time when you make a change in your scene. And if you realize your instances, they will actually just be cached, I think. You can see that by the memory it's using as well, 330. If I realize this, it's going to be slightly higher, and the more moss you got, the higher that value is going to be cranked up to, but it's going to make your viewport perhaps a little bit faster, right? And it will cost you some memory and some VRAM as well, perhaps, so keep that in mind. Now the first one is going to be custom moss collection. Now you will only see that for the first 2 biomes, and the reason why is because, well, I want you to be able to set up your own biomes as well with custom assets, which means that if we create a new collection, for example, let's say I want some spiky strands in there. I'm going to drag this one in, my spiky string, and I want some of my magical things as well. For example, some glowers. I'm going to drag that in. Let's make sure it's actually the right direction. There we go. Drag my glowers in, and a mushroom. Whatever you like, drag it in, jungle flower, and then we can crank or add all of these to a new collection. All right, press M, new collection, just set that to be custom biome. There we go. Now I'm gonna hide it here, and then in your geometry nodes, we can now set this to be our custom biome. And then with biome 1 and 2, you'll be able to actually create your own custom biome with assets throughout this library, right? So that's the reason why there's going to be a custom moss collection in case you want to, well, make your own little biome, which can be fun as well. All right, so that is amazing. I'm going to Ctrl-Z that to be my high performance for a sec. And now the second one is going to be, well, distribution settings. Distribute on top, distribute according to a weight paint group. It can be something you may want at some point, right? So if I set this to be 100%, I can set this to be distribute my moss on top only, and it's gonna be distributing on top of our planes or faces, right? And you can set the custom angle there as well. If you want more moss, you can drag up that angle, you can see. If you want less, so only at those very top faces, you can just crank that down again, right? So distribute moss on top. Beautiful. Now, what I want to do as well is perhaps distribute that according to a weight paint group. a weight paint map. If I select that, nothing happens. The default weight paint group is set to group, and we can now just start weight painting because the first group you will paint will automatically be named group as well. So if I now add some moss here, you can see we're adding moss wherever we want our moss to be, which is very useful. Beautiful. So that is the distribute Mossify weight paint. Amazing. Now we have the moss density, of course. The default values work pretty much all the time. It depends a little bit on your scale of the object, right? I made the geometry nodes in a way where it doesn't really matter how large or how small your object get. You will also always have the same kind of scale and density of the moss, and that makes sure that your computer won't crash if you, for example, drag and drop moss onto a huge building, and then you'll just have to customize some settings yourself. So we have the moss scale, right? If you want smaller moss, make it smaller, right? And crank up the density to 300, for example. You have some smaller soft moss, right? You can see that everything changes incredibly quickly, which is perfect, which is exactly what I wanted to make with this one, a high quality, high performance moss setup. All right, so you can see that everything still changes pretty much real time, which is amazing. So I'm gonna set it back to 2, perhaps set my density back to 150. There we go. And next up, the dryness. That's actually something I had a lot of fun with, right? Every moss can be green, but it can also be dry or more dead, which means we have a dryness value that we can crank up and down for every single biome, right? Every biome has its own dryness setting as well. Even the magical biome and the ocean biome, they have their own dryness levels as well. You can even set that to halfway, for example, which is going to make it a little bit more dry and also a little bit green. So that's something you can completely customize yourself. Beautiful. Next up, the noise scale for the distribution. Something important, of course. If you want larger places that are mossless, you can just set this to, for example, 0.2. You can see we're getting some larger gaps. As I said, if I set this to 1, we're going to get smaller gaps pretty much, right? So that is something you can keep in mind as well. Okay, and if you set it to 0, you'll pretty much have moss everywhere, right? So makes sense, doesn't it? Alright, so next up we have the noise seed, one of the most important settings right here, because it will change your entire moss system. If I up this to a different seed, it's going to change the complete scatter, and it's also going to change the complete, extra assets here that we'll get into now. So the extra assets, what is it? Well, each moss biome needs to have some kind of a customization option. That's what I feel like, right? Some moss systems will have some shells, for example, lying around, or they will have some flowers or some stringy things, right? I think every biome should be customizable, and you can also add your own assets in there, right? So you can create your own assets and scatter them in your moss system. It will be completely amazing. And you can even drag and drop assets from other libraries in a collection and use that as an extra asset collection. So the way this works is I created the extra assets that I wanted to have in there for sure, and there is gonna be a geometry node section and a collection setting. So the collection is for scattering. I made some preset variations. For example, each of these collections will contain 4 different dandelion variants. And the geometry nodes are what you drag in if you want to customize that yourself. If you want to use it somewhere else, for example, you can drag and drop that in, and it will come with customization options just like the moss biome. Alright, so how this works, I'm going to use the extra asset collections, and I'm going to just drag and drop in, for example, my shell collection. Just drag that to the side somewhere, it doesn't matter. Now, if I click back on my actual biome, and I go to my extra asset collection, I can just set this to be my collection of shells. And there we go, we have some shell scattering. So let's up the density to 15, for example. And you can see that we're getting shells pretty much scattered throughout our moss. Now the beautiful part is that this comes with obviously a spawn seed as well, alright, in case you want some different shells seeds. And it comes with skill, of course, very, very important. And this is the beautiful one, the clear extra moss area. Because, well, if there are shells on moss, it means that there is not going to be growing any moss underneath that. It won't get light, for example, stuff like that. And there should not be moss there. right? It shouldn't. So we can actually customize how much extra area we're gonna clear around each shell here, for example. If I set this to 0.2, you can see we're clearing more and more area around our assets. 0.3, even more. If I set this to 0.05, it's gonna get close and tight to our shell. At some point, it'll actually clip through. So usually 0.1 works very well, where the area around the shell, around the extra assets are gonna be cleared. And it's just up to you how much extra space you want to clear, right? So next up, we have our extra asset distance, right? You don't want them to collide within each other, which means that sometimes you just need to increase the distance between those. So if I set this to 1, you can see that they're going to be scattering with more distance and they won't have as much overlap, for example, right? And next up, we have got our extra asset dryness. All right, so what does that do? Let me actually grab in something that has some kind of a dryness version, which is, for example, going to be our plant here, right? Pretty much everything has a dryness value, though it doesn't matter. So, for example, the plant collection, I'm going to drag that in as well. And I'm going to set that to be my second extra asset collection, for example, called plant. And then it will scatter both of these in our system. Now, this is too green for our dry moss system. So now we can actually crank up our extra asset dryness as well, right? So you can see that we're getting a little bit more of a dry color in these assets. And you can see that even in our shells, if I set this all the way to 1, and that's the wrong one, extra asset dryness, if I set it to 1, we're actually gonna add some gaps, some broken parts in our shell, which is quite fun because it looks like our shell is more broken now. Amazing, right? And it works for every asset. Every asset has its own custom dryness value. Even the magical string, for example, if I add that as collection 3, where is it? Magical string. You can see, let me find one. Where are they? I may not have enough density. Let me crank this up to 25. There we go. So here is, for example, one with some sparkles. If I set my dryness all the way to 0, we're actually getting a nice green string. But if I set that back to 1, we're getting our dead string with more yellow particles, right? So everything has its own custom value. Isn't that crazy? All right, so any one of these, you can just drag and drop in the rocks as well. Some basic rocks, of course. It's something you will see. So set that to be rocks as well, and you'll have some extra rod scattering through your scene as well, right? So you can set this value to be very high, 50 for example, even 150. And if you now decrease your extra distance to 0.5, for example, you can see that they're getting much closer and you'll have much more of these objects scattering through your biome. Isn't that amazing? So that is how these extra assets work. Now let's say I'm deleting all of these. And let's say I want to have my own little collection based on assets from within my library, for example. Right, so what I can do is I can drag and drop in whatever I want to scatter. Let's say I want to scatter some stuff from my chaotic fall biome. Let's say this string. So I'm going to drag in some strings here. One string. I'm going to scatter this beautiful string as well. There we go. And let's say I want some magical mushrooms. This one, and I like this one as well. Let's see, perhaps I like this string as well. Make sure that it's going to be the right way up. So let's say this is all that we want to scatter, right? So we have the string, we have our mushroom, the strand, the leaf, and another string. And let's move that M to a new collection, extra assets custom, for example. Now let's move that out of the way and let's set that to be our extra asset collection, right? So extra assets custom. And then that is all going to be scattering around in our biome as well now, right? So let's set that to be a little bit lower, like 50. There we go. And then we have custom assets going through our scene very, very nicely, right? So you can still change your scaling and stuff like that. Now for this one, of course, because it is going to be objects from different biomes, we will not have the dryness values, so you will have to keep that in mind. Those dryness values, custom dryness values are linked to the extra assets that are already included in that file, right? Beautiful, right? So you can actually make your own extra asset collections and even create your own with objects you create yourself, for example. Amazing. Right, so I'm gonna set that back to shell, for example, because I quite like the way that looks. And let's continue with some other settings now. All right, so next up we have our raindrops. All right, so I can enable this. And you can see that we're adding some raindrops to the tips of our moss, right? So that is something I like doing a lot, adding moisturization, raindrops to a lot of things because it makes it look even better. So let's set our moss dryness back to 0 because, well, I think water droplets look a little bit nicer with a nice, fresh set of moss. And we can actually just, well, add more raindrops. For example, if I set this distribution level to 1, we'll have just more raindrops. Same as when we change the density to 500, for example. All right, so you're actually getting some raindrops distributed on the endpoints here. Now, depending on the scale of your object, you may need to do a little bit of customization here with the distance to the core and the layer thickness. And the distance to the core is basically where your raindrops start to show, because there's no real reason to start showing or start having raindrops at the base points of our moss, right? Because you won't see them, it's gonna decrease performance way too much without even seeing results. That is why I'm trying to only distribute them on the endpoints that you can actually see. All right, so that is a little bit of stuff that you need to customize sometimes. So the distance to core 0.05, you may have to crank that down if your raindrops aren't showing. And the layer thickness as well, for example, I think they are a little bit too much to the endpoints. I can just set my my raindrop layer thickness to 0.07, for example. And now they are at the right place again, right? Beautiful. So that is how the raindrop works. It will be at every biome as well, except for the ocean biome, because, well, the ocean is already wet, so you won't really have raindrops, will you? So that is basically what you can do. And then you have, of course, all of the other stuff as well, right? The raindrop scale, if you want them to be bigger, smaller, change that as well. And the next option is fog. All right, the reason I added that is because fog looks amazing when it comes to some moss, right? So if I add a layer of fog here, you can see we're actually adding some fog on the outsides of our moss, and it's actually covering some parts of the moss, and it's adding a very nice kind of vibe, right? And there's a lot you can change here as well. For example, if you want more fog, you can crank that value up and you'll have much thicker fog. You have a fog scale as well. If I want this to be smaller, our actual fog is going to be, well, the layers are going to be smaller as well. And the distance to surface is a very fun one to play around with because it will pretty much, well, highlight how much of the moss will be visible as well. If I set this to 0.2, you can see it's getting a bit more distant to the surface, and only a few of the tips and tips of the shells are sticking out of our fog, for example. And you can also make it closer to the surface. It's up to you. Right, so that is the fog. What else do we need? Right, so I'm gonna turn this off for a second, raindrops as well, because now we have some other amazing values that we can change. And that is even more customization, right? I can imagine that sometimes you want a custom color to your moss or to your extra assets as well, which means that we can actually just crank up our moss custom color value to 1, and we're gonna be adding our custom color to our moss. Isn't that amazing? So you can set this to be whatever you want. Make blue moss, make yellow moss, make pink moss, right? It's anything you want pretty much. I really like white moss for some reason, and that's why it's the default as well. And yeah, you can just set it to be any color that matches your scene well. Okay, the same goes for the extra assets, right? So let's actually add an asset that has some color as well. For example, the plant. And this is now green. Let's crank up that size just a little bit to 2.5. There we go. We have some green plants here, and it doesn't go well with the white, so I want that to be white as well. Crank this up to 1. Your actual objects are gonna be white too, so you can create your own custom biome, make this purple, right? Even the shells will go with it, and this is it. You can pretty much create your own little colors, and if you set this to, for example, 0.5, you'll have a nice mix between colors. Sometimes it may look more realistic, and that's something you can just play around with beautifully, right? So that is pretty much all of the settings that you can change, right? And that has the same for every biome. Now, like I said, for example, if I drag and drop in my magical biome, right, that is not going to have that initial collection that you can change, simply because the first biome only uses one collection to scatter around, which means it's going to be easier to tweak as somebody who doesn't know the geometry node setup as well, right? So that is why the first and the second one will have a custom collection setting at the start where you can add your own moss biome assets, and the other ones will be customly set as presets, right? So for example, this magic biome, if I crank this up to 100%, you can see it looks beautifully magical. It has all the same settings as the other ones as well, and it changes all the same too, right? So we can even add a little white magical biome here, looks amazing. And well, the same values go for every biome. Everything has the same set of customization options. Everything works exactly the same, right? It's just the geometry node setup itself that is going to be different, and that is going to have its own, well, each biome comes with its own custom geometry node variation, its own scatter system as well a little bit. So keep that in mind, right? So beautiful, works very fast. You can see we can change large, dense moss biomes very quickly to new settings, to new versions, right? We can change anything we want, and it's going to have real-time visualization with it as well, right? So that are the biomes, right? So now next to the biomes, let me just delete this, because now I want to get more into the geometry node part of this, right? So every biome comes with the geometry nodes. I told you that. We can drag and drop that in, for example. Let me hide everything that we don't need for a sec. There we go. I can drag and drop my wild strand in, for example, and this is going to come with its own geometry nodes. All right, so we can customize that completely, change the shape, change how it looks, right? I can imagine you may have more use cases for this, right? For example, if you want to create some custom looking weeds for the water, or if you want to customize this into actual grass for grass fields, you can do so quite easily with this as well. All right, make it chaotic, make it less chaotic. You can do whatever you want, and each geometry node 3 will have its own customization options as well. All right, and most of them will be based on curves, which means that if you edit them, you can draw in more of these little geometry nodes, right? Create your own assets, make them work beautifully, right? Each biome has this. I'll just show a couple more. For example, the mushroom as well is quite a fun one. And if I start to customize this, you can see the cap width, the cap height. You can create some very thick looking mushrooms, right? Everything is basically going to be customizable. Same for our magical strands. This is one I actually really like. Where is it? Let me go back into object mode and drag it in. There we go. Right, so this one is a lot of fun as well. It has some light stringy scattering throughout the system. We can change the height. We can change the look at all the values, right? You can change so much that it is amazing and customizable, right? So now let me show you the extra asset geometry nodes as well, right? Because every single one of these is customizable too. For example, our little flower. There we go. It's completely customizable. The position of the leaves, the rotation of the petals as well. That is a fun one to experiment with, right? So you can see the rotation of them change based on those angles. So you can customize that, increase the sizes of those. The starting position of the leaves, right? Make it lower, make it more leaves, less leaves, pretty much everything. And the same with, for example, our complete tree, right? I thought it would be fun to have tiny trees scattering through moss systems as well. So that's why I created this in geometry nodes too. And you can pretty much change all of the settings there as well. You see, beautiful, completely customizable. And I think you will have a lot of use cases for that. Let me just show a few more. For example, the little flower. This one is a lot of options, has a lot of customization. Because even those tiny petals are made from geometry nodes as well. So you can change all the values to create a completely custom flower, right? The mushroom too is completely customizable, right? Draw in more mushrooms with the little draw tool. Beautiful and amazing, right? So that is basically the customization options that you have within Mossify. I think it is quite a lot. I think you'll enjoy it as well. I hope so. And I think I covered everything now, so I hope you have a lot of fun with Mossify. I hope to see some amazing results with maybe even some custom assets for the custom biomes or for the extra assets. And I expect to see some crazy combinations and some amazing renders with it. So have a lot of fun. Thank you already for supporting and for using this. And enjoy. Bye-bye.